The year is 1242, in the heart of a winter that has blanketed the northern highlands in a silence so profound it feels as though the world itself has drifted into a deep, dreamless slumber. Outside the thick, lime-washed stone walls of the croft, the wind does not howl. It merely sighs, a soft, rhythmic respiration that carries the scent of frozen pine needles and the distant, metallic tang of coming snow. The sky is a vast, heavy expanse of bruised purple and charcoal gray, pressing down upon the jagged peaks of the mountains. But here, inside the small, circular room of the weaving chamber, time has slowed to the pace of a single, flickering flame. The hearth is the heart of this space, a wide, stone-paved circle where 3 stout logs of seasoned oak smolder with a gentle, consistent heat. There is no roar of fire here, only the steady, hypnotic crackle of the wood as it surrenders its ancient energy to the air. Occasionally, a tiny pocket of sap within the oak will hiss, a soft, pressurized SSS that lasts for 3 seconds before fading back into the low hum of the room. The smoke rises in a straight, translucent ribbon, guided upward by the draft of the chimney, smelling of sweet earth and the dry, toasted essence of the forest floor. Ilara sits upon a low wooden stool, her back straight but relaxed, draped in a heavy shawl of undyed sheep's wool. The wool is coarse and thick, providing a comforting weight upon her shoulders, a physical reminder of the boundary between the warmth of the hearth and the biting frost beyond the door. Before her lies a large, rectangular table made of solid birch, its surface worn smooth by decades of use, polished to a dull sheen by the oils of 1,000 fleeces. On this table rests the beginning of a secret, a task undertaken in the quiet hours of the afternoon, while the sun hangs low and golden behind the clouds and her husband, Thomas, is away tending to the sheep in the lower valleys. The task is the creation of a great coat, a garment intended to provide a fortress of warmth against the most brutal of the midwinter gales. It is a secret only because the surprise of its weight and the meticulousness of its insulation are meant to be a gift for the solstice, a gesture of quiet care woven into every fiber and stitch. She begins today not with a needle, but with the materials themselves. To her right sits a large wicker basket filled with cured rabbit pelts and the thick, silver-gray furs of the winter fox. Each pelt has been prepared with immense patience over the preceding months. She reaches into the basket, her fingers sinking into the incredible softness of the fox fur. The sensation is immediate and soothing, a cool, silken texture that warms almost instantly against the heat of her palm. She lifts a single pelt, rotating it slowly under the amber glow of the oil lamp. The lamp is a simple vessel of hammered iron filled with rendered tallow. The wick, a braided strand of dried rush, burns with a steady yellow light that casts long, soft-edged shadows across the room. As she moves the fur, the light catches the individual hairs, revealing a spectrum of color that the eye might miss at a distance. Shades of pearl, ash, smoke, and charcoal. She spends several minutes simply observing the way the fur moves, the way the individual guard hairs stand tall and resilient, while the dense undercoat provides a thick, downy cushion beneath. She takes a small, wooden-handled brush with fine bronze bristles and begins the process of grooming the pelt. This is a slow, monotonous movement, scritch, scritch, Scritch. The sound is repetitive and rhythmic, a low-frequency vibration that seems to resonate within the very stones of the floor. She starts at the neck of the pelt and draws the brush downward, following the natural grain of the hair. Each stroke is deliberate. She is looking for any remaining tangles, any tiny burrs that might have escaped the initial cleaning, or any areas where the fur has become slightly matted during storage. 1 stroke, 2 strokes, 3. The brush moves through the silver fur, and with each pass, the coat becomes more uniform, more inviting. She pauses to run her hand over the brushed area, her skin tracing the path the metal bristles have just taken. The fur is now perfectly aligned, a sea of softness that ripples like water when she breathes upon it. She spends nearly an hour on this single pelt, ensuring that every square inch is treated with the same unwavering attention. There is no rush. The winter is long, and the evening is only just beginning to settle into its deeper shades. Next to the fox furs lies a pile of wool batting, thick layers of carded wool that have been washed in the mountain stream and dried by the fire. This wool will serve as the inner lining, the hidden layer of insulation that sits between the outer fur and the wearer's body. Ilara pulls a small tuft of the wool apart. It makes a faint, tearing sound, not sharp, but soft, like the sound of a footstep on dry moss. She feels the lanolin still present in the fibers, a natural oil that makes the wool water-resistant and slightly tacky to the touch. She begins to lay the wool out on the birch table, smoothing it with the palms of her hands. She works from the center outward, pushing away any lumps or irregularities. The goal is a perfectly even thickness, a consistent landscape of cream-colored fluff. Her hands move in wide, sweeping arcs, a dance of tactile measurement. She closes her eyes for a moment, letting her sense of touch guide her. She can feel the subtle variations in density, the places where the wool is a fraction of a millimeter thicker, and she gently teases the fibers apart until the surface is as level as a fresh fall of snow. The atmosphere in the room is one of absolute stillness. The only movement is the slow rise and fall of Ilara's chest as she breathes the warm, wood-scented air, and the occasional shift of a log in the hearth. The shadows on the wall, the silhouettes of the spinning wheel, the stacked firewood and the hanging herbs, remain motionless, anchored by the weight of the winter night. She picks up a small piece of chalk, a fragment of white stone gathered from the southern cliffs. With this, she begins to mark the underside of the fox pelt, the leather side, which is a pale, parchment-like tan. The leather is supple, having been worked with oils until it is as flexible as heavy silk. She draws a line, the chalk making a dry, whispering sound as it drags across the hide. The line is a guide for where the pelt will eventually be joined to its neighbor. She measures the distance with a ruler made of polished horn, noting the marks for every inch with a tiny, precise dot. 1 inch, 2 inches, 3 inches. The process of measurement is an exercise in mindfulness. She does not look ahead to the finished coat. She does not imagine Thomas wearing it in the snow. She focuses entirely on the tip of the chalk and the texture of the leather. She notices the tiny pores in the hide, the subtle variations in its thickness, the way it holds the scent of the tanning oils, a faint, earthy aroma reminiscent of oak bark and rain. After marking the first pelt, she sets it aside on a clean linen cloth and reaches for the next. This one is smaller, a rabbit pelt of pure, snowy white. Its texture is different, finer, more delicate, with a shorter nap. She begins the grooming process again. Scritch, scritch, scritch. The rhythm is identical to the first, a loop of sound that fills the silence without breaking it. The heat from the hearth begins to make her eyelids heavy. It is a pleasant weight, a slow-acting sedative born of warmth and safety. She leans forward slightly, her forehead momentarily cooled by the air further from the fire, before retreating back into the golden circle of light. She watches a single spark rise from the oak logs, drifting upward like a tiny, dying star before vanishing into the darkness of the flue. She thinks of the logistics of the coat. It will require 24 of these fox pelts for the main body and 16 rabbit pelts for the collar and cuffs. Each one must be inspected, brushed, measured, and marked. At her current pace, she will spend the next 4 evenings just on this initial preparation. The thought is not daunting. It is comforting. It is a schedule of peace, a series of predictable, gentle actions that will carry her through the darkest part of the year. She takes a sip of water from a ceramic mug that has been sitting near the hearth. The water is room temperature, tasting faintly of the stone pitcher it was stored in. As she swallows, she feels the coolness travel down her throat, a sharp contrast to the warmth of her skin. She sets the mug back down on the stone hearth, the clink of the pottery muffled by the layer of ash at the edge of the fire. She returns to the white rabbit pelt. She finds a small knot in the fur near the edge. Instead of pulling at it, she uses a small bone pick to gently tease the hairs apart. It is a task that requires the focus of a jeweler. She works one hair at a time, her breath coming slow and shallow so as not to disturb the delicate fibers. The knot gradually unravels, the fur smoothing out until the blemish is gone, leaving only a perfect, unbroken surface of white. The room grows darker as the twilight outside deepens into a true midnight blue. The window, a small aperture set deep into the stone wall, shows nothing but the reflection of the oil lamp and the occasional ghostly flake of snow drifting past. The world outside is a frozen monument, but here, the work continues in its slow, deliberate fashion. Ilara reaches for the horn ruler again. She aligns it with the edge of the birch table, checking its straightness against the grain of the wood. She then places the groomed rabbit pelt alongside the first fox pelt, observing how the colors interact. The silver and the white together evoke the landscape of the mountains, the granite peaks and the snow-filled crevices. She spends a long time looking at them, her eyes tracing the transition from the dark guard hairs of the fox to the brilliant, stark white of the rabbit. She begins to count her supplies once more, a mental inventory that she performs every evening. 12 large needles of polished steel, she whispers to herself, her voice a low murmur that barely carries across the table. 3 spools of waxed linen thread, 2 jars of pine resin for sealing the seams, a square of deer hide for the internal pockets. Each item is checked off in her mind. The counting is a lullaby, a litany of preparedness. As long as the supplies are there, as long as the fire is fed, and as long as the walls hold back the frost, all is well. She picks up the third pelt, another fox, this one with more amber tones near the base of the tail. She feels the weight of it in her hand. It is light, almost weightless, yet it holds the potential for incredible warmth. She begins the brushwork once more. Scritch, scritch, scritch. The sound begins to blend with the rhythm of her own heartbeat. The flickering light of the tallow lamp creates a pulse of amber and gold that matches the movement of the brush. Everything in the room, the scent of the wood smoke, the texture of the fur, the weight of the wool shawl, the taste of the stone-chilled water, conspires to pull the consciousness down into a state of heavy, contented repose. The morning of the following day arrives not with a burst of sunlight, but with a gradual, imperceptible transition from the charcoal of night to a pale, milky silver. The frost upon the small window pane has grown during the dark hours, creating intricate, crystalline forests that climb the glass in delicate, fern-like patterns. Ilara wakes to the rhythmic sound of her own breathing and the distant, muffled lowing of a cow in the barn attached to the far side of the croft. She remains still for a long moment, feeling the warmth of the heavy wool blankets draped over her, their weight a grounding force against the chill that has crept into the corners of the room. Thomas has already departed. The faint, lingering scent of his breakfast, oatmeal and dried apples, wafts up from the hearth below. He left before the first light to check the high-altitude fences, knowing that the heavy snows of the coming week might trap the stray ewes in the crags. His absence provides the silence and the space required for the secret work to resume. The house is a vessel of quietude, the only movement being the slow drift of dust motes in the single shaft of gray light that manages to pierce the frosted window. Ilara descends the ladder from the sleeping loft, her bare feet meeting the cool, smooth stones of the floor. She moves to the hearth and stirs the embers which have slept under a blanket of white ash. With a small iron poker, she gently nudges the coals, revealing the glowing orange heart of the fire. She adds a handful of dried kindling, shavings of cedar and birch bark, that ignite with a soft, cheerful pop and a sudden, bright flare of yellow flame. She then places 2 medium-sized logs of maple atop the kindling. The maple catches slowly, its smoke smelling clean and slightly sweet. While the fire finds its strength, Ilara returns to the birch table in the weaving chamber. The silver fox pelts and the white rabbit furs remain exactly where she left them, undisturbed and expectant. Today, the focus shifts from preparation to the precision of the tools. She reaches for a small, cylindrical wooden box made of turned boxwood. The lid fits tightly, letting out a dry, wooden creak as she twists it open. Inside, resting on a bed of dark green velvet, are her needles. These are not ordinary needles. They are the pride of her sewing kit, crafted by a master smith in the valley and polished until they gleam like shards of fallen stars. There are 12 in total, each a different length and thickness, designed for specific stages of the garment's construction. She selects the 3 most suited for leatherwork, needles with a triangular point, known as Glover's needles, which are designed to slice through the hide rather than piercing it, preventing the leather from tearing. She takes a small piece of whetstone, a flat gray sliver of slate, and begins to hone the tip of the first needle. She holds the steel at a precise angle, her thumb and forefinger applying a steady, light pressure. Swish, swish, swish. The sound of the metal against the stone is high-pitched but soft, a metallic whisper that echoes the rhythm of the grooming brush from the night before. She rotates the needle, ensuring that each of the 3 edges is sharpened to a razor-like finish. She tests the point against the pad of her thumb, not to draw blood, but to feel the instantaneous catch of the steel. It is perfect. Once the needles are prepared, she turns her attention to the thread. For a coat of this magnitude, standard wool or cotton thread would be insufficient. She requires the strength of flaxen linen. She pulls a large spool from her basket, the thread a natural, unbleached cream color. It is rough to the touch, composed of long, resilient fibers that have been spun tight. Before the thread can be used, it must be conditioned. Alara reaches into a small leather pouch and retrieves a block of beeswax. The wax is a deep, translucent amber, harvested from the hives in the orchard during the late summer. It feels cool and hard in her hand, but as she holds it, the warmth of her skin begins to soften its outer edges. She brings the wax to her nose, inhaling the scent of sun-drenched clover and the ancient, resinous smell of the hive. She takes the end of the linen thread and presses it into the side of the wax block with her thumb. Then, with a slow, steady pull of her right arm, she draws the entire length of the thread through the wax. Zip. The sound is a low, tactile friction. She repeats this motion 3 times for every length of thread she cuts. The wax coats the linen, filling the gaps between the fibers, making the thread smooth, water-resistant, and incredibly strong. As she works, she notices the way the wax changes the appearance of the thread. What was once a dull, fibrous cord now has a subtle, waxy sheen, catching the light like a polished tendon. It no longer tangles or kinks. It flows through her fingers with a heavy, deliberate grace. She prepares 10 such lengths, each the span of her outstretched arms, and drapes them carefully over the back of her chair to prevent them from touching the floor. The room has warmed now. The maple logs are burning with a steady, orange glow, and the chill has retreated to the very edges of the stone walls. Alara takes her seat at the table, the heavy wool shawl once again draped over her shoulders. She takes the first 2 silver fox pelts and places them side by side, fur side down on the birch surface. This is the moment of the first union. She aligns the edges of the pale, supple leather with agonizing slowness. She uses the horn ruler to ensure that the vertical grain of the fur matches perfectly across the seam. If the grain is off by even a few degrees, the light will catch the finished coat unevenly, revealing the join. She adjusts the left pelt by a hair's breadth to the north, then the right pelt by a fraction to the south. She breathes out, a long, slow sigh that ruffles the fine white hairs of the rabbit pelts nearby. She picks up her first needle and threads it. The waxed linen passes through the eye of the needle with ease, requiring no effort. She ties a small, neat knot at the end of the thread, a square knot, doubled for security. She begins the first stitch at the very top of the shoulder seam. The needle enters the leather with a satisfying, muffled thud. Because the needle is so sharp, there is no resistance, only the sensation of the steel gliding through the dense, oiled hide. She pulls the thread through until the knot seats itself firmly against the leather. The sound of the waxed thread following the needle is a distinctive rip, a sound of structural integrity. She uses a furrier's stitch, a series of small, tight loops that wrap around the edges of the 2 pieces of leather. Each stitch is exactly 3 millimeters apart. She does not guess the distance. She uses the tiny dots she marked with chalk the previous night. Stitch 1. The needle goes in, the thread pulls through, vrip. Stitch 2. The needle goes in, the thread pulls through, vrip. Stitch 3. The needle goes in, the thread pulls through, vrip. The repetition is profoundly hypnotic. Ilara's world shrinks down to the 3 millimeters of space between the stitches. She watches the way the waxed thread bites into the leather, pulling the two edges together until the seam is invisible. She uses her left thumb to hold the fur away from the needle, ensuring that no stray hairs are caught in the stitch. If a hair is trapped, it will create a tiny lump in the seam, a flaw that her fingers would feel every time she touched the coat. She works with a rhythmic, mechanical precision. Her hand moves in a circular arc down through the leather, around the edge, and back up for the next entry. The movement is so ingrained in her muscle memory that she can almost do it with her eyes closed. She listens to the sounds of the house, the soft crackle of the maple fire, the occasional thump of snow sliding off the roof, and the steady, reassuring vrip of the thread. After 20 stitches, she pauses. She takes a small wooden mallet with a flat, polished head and gently taps the seam she has just created. Tap, tap, tap. This flattens the leather and ensures the stitches are seated deeply into the hide. It also helps to blend the fur on the other side. She turns the two pelts over to inspect her progress. On the fur side, the seam has vanished. The silver guard hairs of the two separate foxes now mingle as if they grew from the same creature. She runs her hand over the area. It is perfectly smooth, a seamless transition of texture and color. She feels a quiet sense of satisfaction, a low burning warmth in her chest that matches the heat of the hearth. She spends the next several hours in this state of focused monotony. She joins the third pelt to the second, then the fourth to the third. Each pelt requires the same level of attention. The alignment, the sharpening of the needle, the waxing of the thread, the 3 millimeter stitches, and the final tapping with the mallet. The logistics of the coat are starting to take physical form. The back panel is beginning to emerge, a wide, shimmering expanse of silver and gray. It is heavy, much heavier than the individual pelts suggested. When she lifts the growing piece to move it, the leather feels substantial and protective, a true barrier against the elements. She stops for a brief moment of rest, her fingers slightly stiff from the repetitive motion. She rubs them together, the warmth of the friction easing the tension. She looks out the window. The gray light of the morning has turned into the flat, white light of midday. The snow has begun to fall, large, wet flakes that drift downward in no particular hurry, adding another layer of silence to the world. She imagines the finished coat. It will be more than a garment. It will be a mobile shelter. The fox fur will provide the primary insulation, trapping a layer of warm air against the body. The rabbit fur lining will provide a soft, secondary layer of comfort. The waxed linen thread will ensure the coat survives years of wear in the damp and the cold. And the secret, the fact that it was made in these quiet, stolen hours, will be the soul of the gift. She returns to her needle. There are still 4 more pelts to join before the back panel is complete. She picks up the block of beeswax and prepares a fresh length of thread. Zip. 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 The sound resets the rhythm of the room. The fire has settled into a deep, pulsing bed of coals, casting a steady, crimson light onto the floor. Ilara reaches for the next silver fox pelt, her fingers finding the familiar softness, and begins the process once more. The winter continues its slow march outside, but inside, the work moves at its own deliberate pace, one stitch at a time, weaving a legacy of warmth into the heart of the cold. The needle enters the leather, the thread pulls through, vrip. The afternoon light has shifted from a flat, chalky white to a deep, ethereal cerulean, a color that only exists in the high latitudes during the heart of the frost. This is the blue hour, a time when the boundaries between the snowy earth and the heavy sky seem to dissolve into a single, seamless gradient of cold. Inside the croft, however, the blue of the window is merely a backdrop for the deepening amber of the hearth. The maple logs have burned down into a thick, pulsating bed of coals that radiate a dry, penetrating heat, turning the stone floor near the chimney into a warm island in a sea of cool shadows. Ilara has reached a milestone in the construction of the great coat. The back panel, composed of the 8 largest silver fox pelts, is now a singular, cohesive piece of architecture. It lies across the birch table like a fallen cloud, its edges slightly irregular but its surface a masterpiece of blended fur. She stands for a moment, her hands resting on the edge of the table, simply breathing in the scent of the room. The smell of the waxed linen thread has mingled with the faint, muskier scent of the fox leather and the sweet, lingering ghost of the maple smoke. It is the smell of industry, of safety, and of a winter well managed. She decides it is time to address the inner lining, the secret layer of softness that will rest against Thomas's tunic. For this, she turns to the basket of white rabbit furs. These pelts are significantly smaller than the fox hides, and their leather is thinner, almost like heavy parchment. They require a different touch, a more delicate hand, and a shift in her internal rhythm. She clears a space on the table, moving the heavy fox panel to a sturdy wooden rack near the fire. As she lifts the fox fur, she feels the surprising weight of it. It is not a burden, but a promise of protection. She drapes it carefully over the smooth wooden dowel of the rack, smoothing the fur one last time with the back of her hand. The guard hairs catch the orange light of the coals, shimmering with a metallic luster that seems to hold the heat of the fire. Returning to the table, she begins to lay out the rabbit pelts. She needs to create a grid, a mosaic of white that will eventually be stitched to the underside of the silver fox. She picks up the first rabbit pelt. It is incredibly light, feeling like little more than a handful of mountain mist. She lays it flat, fur side down, exposing the pale, cream-colored leather. She reaches for her cutting tool, a small, curved blade made of tempered steel with a handle of polished applewood. The blade is so sharp that it can split a single hair, but its purpose today is to square the pelts. Because rabbits are irregular in shape, she must trim the edges of each pelt into a perfect rectangle so they can be joined without gaps or overlapping lumps. Before she begins cutting, she must sharpen the blade. This is a ritual of focus. She takes a small, rectangular oilstone from her sewing chest. The stone is a dark, porous gray, and she applies 3 drops of clear linseed oil to its surface. Drip, drip, drip. The oil beads on the stone for a second before spreading into a thin, glistening film. She places the edge of the applewood-handled blade against the stone and begins a long, slow stroking motion. S-H-H-H-Hink, S-H-H-H-Hink, S-H-H-H-Hink. The sound is fluid and metallic, a low-frequency slide that seems to vibrate through the wood of the table and into her very bones. She moves the blade in a figure-8 pattern, ensuring the entire length of the edge is treated equally. She does this for 10 minutes, her eyes fixed on the point where the steel meets the stone. She watches the tiny wake of oil that the blade pushes ahead of itself, a miniature wave that catches the flickering light of the hearth. There is a profound peace in the repetition. The world outside may be freezing. The winds may be gathering strength for the night's gale. But here, the only thing that matters is the angle of the steel and the smoothness of the stone. Once the blade is sufficiently honed, she wipes it clean with a piece of scrap linen. She then returns to the first rabbit pelt. She places a small, rectangular template made of thin, sanded oak over the leather. With a light but firm hand, she draws the blade along the edge of the template. The sound of the blade cutting through the rabbit leather is almost non-existent, a faint, silken whisper as the fibers part. The excess leather curls away like a shaving of wood. She moves to the next side, then the next, until the irregular pelt has been transformed into a perfect, four-sided rectangle. She sets the trimmings aside. They will not be wasted. Later, they will be used to stuff a small pillow or to line the insides of a pair of mittens. 1 rectangle, 2 rectangles, 3 rectangles. She repeats the process 16 times. Each pelt is slightly different in its thickness, and she adjusts the pressure of her hand accordingly. Her movements are slow and deliberate, a study in low-stakes precision. As she works, she counts the rectangles under her breath, a rhythmic litany that keeps her mind from wandering too far into the cold of the evening. 4, 5, 6. By the time she reaches the 10th pelt, the table is covered in a neat stack of white leather squares. She pauses to take a sip of herbal tea she prepared earlier. It is a blend of dried rose hips and mint, and it has cooled to a pleasant, lukewarm temperature. The steam has long since vanished, but the flavor is bright and clean, cutting through the heavy, resinous air of the room. She feels the liquid travel slowly down her throat, a small, internal warmth that complements the external heat of the fire. Now comes the task of joining the rabbit squares. For this, she selects a finer needle, one with a smaller eye and a more slender profile. The waxed linen thread she used for the fox fur would be too heavy for the delicate rabbit leather, so she reaches for a spool of fine silk thread, a deep cream color that matches the leather perfectly. The silk is smooth and cool, lacking the tactile grip of the linen, but possessing a tensile strength that is deceptive. She waxes the silk thread with the same amber block of beeswax. Zzz-zip, zzz-zip. The sound is higher in pitch than it was with the linen, a delicate, insect-like hum. She threads the fine needle, the silk passing through the eye with a ghostly ease. She begins the whip stitch, a technique that will allow the rabbit pelts to lie perfectly flat against one another. She joins the first 2 squares, her needle moving in a series of tiny, diagonal loops. Stitch, pull. The rhythm is faster than the furrier's stitch, but no less hypnotic. The silk thread makes a faint tink as it passes through the thin leather, a sound like a single drop of rain hitting a leaf. She works her way down the first row, joining 4 squares into a long, white strip. As she finishes the first row, she takes a moment to admire the contrast. She picks up the strip and turns it over. On the first side, the rabbit hair is a dense, snowy thicket. It is so soft that it feels almost liquid, flowing over her fingers like cream. She imagines this softness resting against the small of Thomas's back, providing a buffer of pure comfort against the rigors of his work. The work continues. Row after row of rabbit fur is joined together. The mosaic grows, expanding across the birch table like a rising tide of white. Ilara's focus is unwavering. She notices the way her shadow, cast by the low-burning fire, stretches long and thin across the floor, the silhouette of her hands moving with the grace of a weaver's shuttle. She thinks about the logistics of the pockets. She has a square of deer hide, tanned with oak bark until it is the color of dark honey. This leather is much tougher than the fox or the rabbit, intended to hold heavy items, a pocket knife, a whetstone, or a handful of dried meat. She decides to place the internal pockets between the fox outer shell and the rabbit lining, so they are hidden and secure. She picks up the deer hide and feels its rugged texture. It has a distinct grain, a series of tiny, pebbled undulations that provide a tactile grip. She uses her bone pick to mark the shape of the pocket, a simple, deep rectangle with a reinforced top edge. She begins to sew the deer hide pocket onto the underside of the fox panel. Because the deer hide is so thick, she returns to her heavy, triangular-pointed needles and the waxed linen thread. Thud, vrip, thud, vrip. The sound is a return to the foundational strength of the coat. The needle requires more force now, and she uses a small leather thimble, a palm guard, to push the needle through the multiple layers of hide. The resistance of the leather is satisfying, a physical manifestation of the garment's durability. She reinforces the corners of the pocket with a cross stitch, creating a small X of waxed linen that will prevent the seam from ripping under the weight of Thomas's tools. The afternoon has fully surrendered to the evening. The blue hour has deepened into a velvety black, and the frost on the window has crystallized into even more complex geometries. The fire in the hearth has settled into a state of glowing equilibrium, providing a steady, silent heat that makes the air feel thick and comforting. Ilara finishes the second pocket. She runs her hand inside it, checking for any stray threads or rough spots. The interior is smooth and deep, exactly as she intended. She then lays the growing rabbit fur lining over the fox panel to check the fit. The white silk and the silver fox fur meet at the edges, a stunning combination of colors that reminds her of a frozen river tucked between granite banks. She feels a wave of drowsiness wash over her, not a sudden exhaustion, but a slow, heavy descent into the desire for rest. The repetitive motion of the needle, the warmth of the fire, and the absolute silence of the snow-covered world have created a perfect environment for sleep. She decides to complete one more row of rabbit squares before calling it a night. She picks up the silk thread, she waxes it, zip, zip. She joins the next square. Stitch, pull. The sound of the needle and the thread becomes a lullaby, a soft, percussive rhythm that marks the passage of time in this small, warm sanctuary. The secret coat is nearly half finished. The back is done, the lining is emerging, and the pockets are secure. As she works the final stitches of the evening, she feels a profound sense of connection to the materials, to the craft, and to the quiet, enduring spirit of the winter. She ties off the silk thread with a tiny, invisible knot. She smooths the rabbit fur one last time, her fingers lingering in the softness. She stands, stretches her back, and watches the last glow of the maple coals. The work is good. The secret is safe. The night is long, and the sleep will be deep. The night has now fully matured, wrapping the Highland croft in a velvet shroud that feels as thick and insulating as the furs upon Alara's table. Outside, the world has ceased to exist in any way other than through the senses of sound and temperature. The wind has dropped to a mere ghost of a breeze, yet it carries a bite that would turn a man's breath to needles of ice in an instant. Against this external frozen void, the interior of the house has become a dense, pressurized pocket of warmth and domesticity. The smell of the maple wood has deepened, the initial sweetness of the smoke replaced by a more grounded, savory scent of charred timber and ancient earth. Alara remains in the weaving chamber, her small world illuminated by the singular, unwavering heart of the oil lamp. The flame is small, no larger than a thumbnail, but it is a giant in this darkness. She watches the way the light interacts with the dust motes that hang suspended in the still air. They drift in slow, lazy spirals, rising with the warmth of the fire and falling as they near the cooler stone walls. She finds herself tracking a single speck of dust for nearly a minute, watching it dance above the silver fox fur before it finally settles, invisible among the millions of guard hairs. Her focus tonight turns to the front panels of the great coat. If the back panel was the foundation, the front panels are the face of the garment, the part that will bear the brunt of the mountain winds and shield Thomas's chest from the creeping frost. She reaches for the remaining silver fox pelts, the choicest of the lot, selected for their density and the brilliance of their silver-tipped hair. She begins by laying out two large pelts side by side. These will form the upper chest. She spends a significant amount of time, perhaps 20 minutes, just looking at them. In the dim light, she is searching for symmetry. Nature does not produce perfect duplicates, but for a garment of this quality, the left side must mirror the right in its flow. She looks at the way the dark cross pattern, typical of the fox's shoulders, sits on each hide. She moves the left pelt up by a fraction of an inch, then tilts the right pelt slightly to the left. Shift, pause, observe, shift, pause, observe. The movement of the leather across the birch table makes a soft, dragging sound, a low-frequency hiss that is incredibly satisfying to the ear. It is the sound of heavy, well-oiled material moving over smooth, seasoned wood. Finally, the alignment is perfect. To an untrained eye, they were identical from the start, but to Alara's fingertips and her fire-strained eyes, they have only now reached a state of equilibrium. She picks up her chalk. It is a small, irregular piece of white stone, worn down into a comfortable wedge shape that fits perfectly between her thumb and forefinger. She prepares to mark the curve of the armholes. This is a critical moment. If the curve is too shallow, the coat will pinch at the shoulders. If it is too deep, the cold will find a way in. She places a wooden template, a crescent carved from apple wood, onto the leather. She begins to draw, scritch, scritch. The chalk moves in a slow, deliberate arc. She feels the vibration of the stone as it passes over the microscopic pores of the leather. The white line it leaves behind is crisp and clean against the tan hide. She does not draw the entire curve in one motion. Instead, she works in small, 3-inch segments, stopping to check the template's position after each one. 1 curve marked, 2 curves marked. Now comes the act that requires the most courage and the steadiest hand, the cutting of the front panels. She takes her applewood-handled blade and returns to the oilstone. Even though she sharpened it only an hour ago, she desires the blade to be at its absolute peak. The rhythm is a tether, grounding her in the present moment. She spends 5 minutes on the stone, the oil-blackened surface glistening under the lamp. She wipes the blade with her linen cloth, the fabric catching on the edge, a sign of terrifying sharpness. She positions the blade at the start of the chalk line. She takes a deep, slow breath, feeling the expansion of her ribs against her wool shawl. She begins to cut. The sound is different now that she is cutting through the thicker fox hide. It is a deep, resonant crunch, the sound of thousands of tiny leather fibers being severed simultaneously. She moves the blade at a pace of 1 inch every 10 seconds. She is not merely cutting, she is sculpting. She follows the white chalk line with the precision of a hawk, her eyes never wavering from the point of contact. As the blade moves, a small bow wave of silver fur is pushed aside. The smell of the leather becomes more intense as the internal fibers are exposed to the air, a scent that is slightly salty, slightly sweet, and entirely primal. She finishes the first armhole and lifts the scrap of fur. It is a crescent-shaped piece of silver beauty. She doesn't discard it. She places it in a separate precious scraps bowl. These will eventually become the trim for the hood, or perhaps a small, warm lining for a tinder pouch. She repeats the process for the second panel. Crunch, crunch, crunch. The sound fills the room, a steady, monotonous, percussive beat that marks the progress of the night. Once the panels are shaped, she must address the front opening, the edges where the coat will eventually be buttoned or toggled. These edges will be handled more than any other part of the garment, and they must be reinforced to prevent the leather from stretching or warping over time. For this, she uses stay tape, which she makes herself from strips of heavy, unbleached linen. She pulls a roll of the linen from her basket. The fabric is stiff and starchy, having been treated with a thin wash of flour water during its weaving. She cuts a strip 2 inches wide and as long as the coat's front. She then reaches for a small ceramic pot that has been sitting on a warm stone near the hearth. Inside the pot is her sealing resin. It is a mixture of pine sap, beeswax, and a drop of linseed oil. It has melted into a thick, honey-like consistency. She uses a small, flat wooden spatula to stir the resin. The smell is extraordinary, a concentrated essence of the forest, sharp and medicinal, but deeply comforting. It reminds her of the woods in midsummer, when the sun is hot enough to make the trees weep gold. She applies a thin, transparent layer of the resin to one side of the linen strip. Schlop, spread, schlop, spread. The spatula makes a wet, rhythmic sound as it distributes the goo. She then presses the linen strip onto the edge of the fox leather on the underside. She uses her fingers to smooth the linen down. The resin provides an immediate, tacky bond. She works her way down the length of the panel, pressing the fabric into the leather with the heel of her hand. The warmth of her skin helps the resin penetrate the fibers of both the linen and the hide. It is a slow, methodical process of lamination. Press, slide, hold, press, slide, hold. Her hands become slightly sticky, but she does not mind. The resin smells so clean, so pure, that it feels like a form of therapy. Once the stay tape is in place, she takes a clean linen cloth and wipes away any excess resin that might have squeezed out from the edges. The front panels are now ready for the next stage, the attachment of the rabbit fur facings. These facings will line the very edge of the opening, so that when Thomas buttons the coat, he feels only the softest fur against his neck and chin, rather than the rougher edge of the fox leather or the linen tape. She selects 2 long, narrow strips of white rabbit fur. She has already squared these earlier, but she checks them again for any stray hairs or imperfections. She aligns them with the front edge of the fox panels. The contrast is striking. The deep, multi-toned silver of the fox against the brilliant, virginal white of the rabbit. It looks like the first light of dawn hitting a frost-covered ridge. She picks up her fine needle and the cream-colored silk thread. Zip, zip. The waxing of the thread is a brief, familiar interlude. She begins to sew the rabbit facing to the reinforced fox edge. Because she is now sewing through 3 layers, rabbit leather, linen stay tape, and fox leather, the work is slower. The needle requires a firm, steady push. Push, pull, rip, push, pull, rip. The sound is denser now, a more complex acoustic event. She feels the resistance of the linen tape, which adds a certain snap to each stitch. She works with her head bowed, her focus so intense that the rest of the room fades into a blur of amber and shadow. She is aware of the fire only as a source of heat against her left cheek, and of the wind only as a distant, rhythmic pulse against the stone walls. She notices that her breathing has synced with her needlework. She inhales as she pushes the needle through, and exhales as she pulls the thread taut. It is a closed loop of existence, a meditative state where the creation of the coat is the only reality. She finishes the first facing. She runs her hand down the edge. The transition from the fox to the rabbit is seamless. The linen tape is hidden within, providing a hidden skeleton of strength that will keep the coat's shape for decades. She feels the weight of the panel. It is becoming a serious object, a piece of equipment that could mean the difference between life and death in a blizzard. She takes a moment to look at her hands. They are the hands of a maker, dusted with chalk, scented with pine resin, and slightly reddened by the heat of the fire. She feels a deep, quiet pride. This coat is a secret, yes, but it is also a prayer of protection, a physical manifestation of her care for her husband. She looks at the oil lamp. The tallow is running low, the flame beginning to dance as it nears the end of the wick. She decides to finish the second facing by the light of the hearth alone. She moves her chair closer to the fire, the orange glow illuminating the white rabbit fur until it looks like it is made of living coals. Push, pull, rip. The rhythm continues in the semi-darkness. The shadows of her hands on the stone floor are huge and flickering, like the wings of a great bird. The silence of the house is absolute, broken only by the occasional thump of a log settling in the ash or the soft click of her needle hitting the wooden table. As she ties off the final stitch of the second panel, she feels a profound sense of completion. The front of the coat is born. She lays the two panels side by side on the table, their silver and white surfaces shimmering in the dying firelight. They look like two halves of a shield. She stands up, her limbs feeling heavy and loose. She stretches her arms toward the ceiling, feeling the tension drain from her shoulders. She looks toward the window. The frost has grown so thick that it has become opaque, a white wall of ice that separates her from the infinite cold of the highlands. She moves to the hearth and uses a small shovel to bank the coals, covering the glowing embers with a thick layer of gray ash. This will keep the fire alive until the morning, a hidden heart of heat that will wait for her return. She blows out the last flicker of the oil lamp. The room is plunged into a deep, textured darkness, illuminated only by the faint, red pulse of the banked coals. Ilara makes her way toward the ladder, her feet finding the familiar stones with ease. The secret coat stays behind, resting on the birch table, a silver and white promise of warmth in the heart of the winter night. The work is done for now. The silence is complete. The sleep will be as deep as the snow. The third morning of the secret endeavor begins with a sky the color of a tarnished pewter spoon. The world outside the croft has been erased by a thick, freezing fog that has settled into the valley, turning the distant pines into ghostly, skeletal fingers reaching through the mist. There is no wind today, only a heavy, expectant stillness that makes every sound inside the house. The settle of a stone, the tick of the cooling hearth, seem amplified and significant. Ilara wakes before the light has fully permeated the frost on her window, her mind already tracking the logistics of the day's most complex task, the sleeves. She descends to the main room, her movements fluid and practiced. The coals she banked the night before are still glowing with a dim, resilient heat beneath their shroud of ash. She uses a small bellows made of dark leather and brass to breathe life back into the hearth. Whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. The sound of the air is soft and rhythmic. A tiny spark catches a fragment of birch bark, and a bright, curling flame licks upward, illuminating the silver-gray walls. She adds a few split logs of seasoned ash wood. Ash burns steadily and cleanly, providing a bright light that will be essential for the fine needlework required for the articulated joints of the sleeves. She returns to the birch table, which has become a sanctuary of texture. Today, she must construct the two cylindrical forms that will protect Thomas's arms. This is a matter of both warmth and mobility. If the sleeves are too stiff, he will struggle to swing his axe or guide the plow. If they are too thin, the frost will seep through his elbows and numb his grip. She selects the remaining fox pelts, specifically looking for the ones with the longest, densest guard hair to provide maximum wind resistance. She begins by creating a pattern for the sleeves. She does not use parchment, which is a rare and expensive commodity. Instead, she uses a shaping board, a flat piece of pine upon which she has carved the ideal dimensions for a man's sleeve, based on the measurements of Thomas's old woolen tunic. She lays the fox pelts onto the board, fur side down. The first step is the grading of the fur. She runs her fingers from the shoulder end of the pelt down to the wrist. The fur must flow in one direction, downward, so that rain or melting snow will slide off the garment rather than soaking into the undercoat. She spends nearly 40 minutes just arranging the pelts for the first sleeve. She has 4 pelts for each arm, and they must be joined in a way that the silver mask of the fox's back sits precisely on the outer curve of the arm. Observe a line smooth. Observe a line smooth. The repetition of the movement is a form of tactile meditation. Her hands move over the leather, feeling the subtle differences in thickness between the neck of the fox and its flanks. The neck leather is tough and resilient, ideal for the shoulder, while the flank leather is softer and more flexible, perfect for the inner elbow. She makes these decisions with a quiet, internal logic, her mind a quiet calculator of durability and comfort. She picks up her chalk and marks the cutting lines. The scritch of the stone against the hide is the only sound in the room, save for the soft, persistent purr of the ashwood fire. Once marked, she takes her applewood-handled blade. She checks the edge with her thumb. It is still sharp from the previous day's honing, but she gives it 3 quick passes on a leather strop she keeps hanging from the side of the table. Flap, flap, flap. The sound of the steel on the leather strop is a dull, percussive thud. She begins to cut the sleeve panels. Unlike the large, broad strokes used for the back, these cuts are more intricate. She must create a slight S curve at the shoulder to allow for the rotation of the arm. She moves the blade with the grace of a calligrapher, the leather parting before the steel with a faint, whispering hiss. Once the 4 pieces for the first sleeve are cut, she sets them in a neat row. She then repeats the entire process for the second sleeve, ensuring that it is a perfect mirror image of the first. This symmetry is vital. A lopsided coat would not only look poor but would hang unevenly on the body, creating cold spots where the fabric pulls away from the skin. With the panels cut, she prepares her thread. She returns to the heavy linen thread and the block of golden beeswax. Zip, zip, zip. The sound of the thread being waxed is a familiar comfort, a rhythmic signal that the assembly is beginning. She threads her largest triangular needle, the steel cold against her fingertips before it warms to the temperature of her hand. The sewing of the sleeve is a tube construction. She joins the first 2 panels, fur side in, using the same 3mm furrier's stitch she mastered during the work on the back panel. Stitch, pull, rip, stitch, pull, rip. The sound is deeper here, as the leather is slightly thicker at the shoulder join. She feels the resistance of the hide against the needle, the pop, as the triangular point shears through the fibers. She uses a bone seam router to flatten the leather as she goes, pressing the tool along the seam to ensure it sits flush. This prevents the seam from becoming a ridge that would chafe against Thomas's arm. As she reaches the midpoint of the sleeve, the elbow, she pauses. This is an area of high wear. She decides to incorporate a reinforcement stay made of a thin strip of the deer hide she used for the pockets. This stay will be hidden between the fox outer and the rabbit lining. She cuts a 2-inch strip of the honey-colored deer leather and positions it over the inner seam of the elbow. Sewing through the fox leather, and the deer hide simultaneously requires a significant amount of force. She puts on her leather palm thimble, a thick disc of rawhide that allows her to use the strength of her entire hand to drive the needle. Push, grunt, vrip, push, grunt, vrip. The effort is slow and rhythmic. She isn't in a hurry. She notices the way the light from the ash fire catches the silver needles in her sewing box, creating a series of tiny, dancing reflections on the ceiling. She feels the weight of the sleeve growing in her lap. It is a substantial thing, a heavy limb of silver and gray. After 2 hours of continuous stitching, the first sleeve is a complete cylinder. She turns it right side out to inspect the fur. She reaches her arm through the sleeve to test the fit. The sensation is extraordinary. The dense fox fur surrounds her arm in a cocoon of immediate dry warmth. It feels as though her arm has been submerged in a pool of heated silk. She moves her elbow, watching the way the guard hairs ripple and part, then settle back into a perfect, unbroken surface. The deer hide stay is invisible, but she can feel the support it provides to the structure. She takes a small break to tend to her own needs. She moves to the kitchen area of the croft and retrieves a small wooden bowl of dried pears and a piece of hard, salty cheese. She eats slowly, savoring the contrast between the sweetness of the fruit and the sharp tang of the cheese. She drinks a cup of cool water, listening to the silence of the fog-bound world. The mist has not lifted. If anything, it has grown thicker, pressing against the stones of the house like a cold, wet blanket. She returns to the second sleeve. The repetition is not a burden. It is a relief. In a world of unpredictable winters and the constant struggle for survival, the predictable, measurable progress of the needle is a source of profound peace. Stitch, pull, vrip, stitch, pull, vrip. She thinks about the history of this craft. She remembers her mother teaching her how to prepare a hide when she was no taller than the birch table, how to scrape the fat away without nicking the skin, how to use the brains of the animal to soften the leather, how to read the grain of the fur. It is a lineage of knowledge, passed down through generations of women who spent their winters by the fire, building fortresses of warmth for their families. There is a quiet power in it, a silent history of care that never makes it into the chronicles of kings and battles. The second sleeve takes shape as the afternoon light begins to fail. The blue hour returns, though today it is more of a gray hour due to the fog. The window is a rectangle of slate-colored gloom. Ilara works on, her hands moving with a life of their own. She finishes the second elbow reinforcement, the pop of the needle through the deer hide marking the rhythm of her progress. She now has 2 completed sleeves. They lie on the table like the discarded husks of some silver-furred giants. The next step is the most daunting, the setting of the sleeves into the armholes of the main body. This requires the alignment of the curves she cut yesterday. She picks up the massive back panel and the 2 front panels. She pins them together at the shoulders using long, blunt, tacking needles made of polished bone. She then takes the first sleeve and aligns it with the circular opening. This is a 3-dimensional puzzle. The sleeve must be eased into the hole, meaning she has to distribute the slightly larger circumference of the sleeve evenly around the smaller hole of the body to allow for the swell of the shoulder muscle. She uses her bone pick to mark the alignment points, one at the top, one at the bottom, two at the sides. She begins the join. This is the most structural seam of the entire coat. If this seam fails, the arm will literally fall off the garment. She uses a double strand of the waxed linen thread, creating a seam of immense strength. Stitch, pull, rip, tug, stitch, pull, rip, tug. The tug at the end of each stitch ensures the knot is buried deep within the leather. She works slowly, rotating the entire weight of the coat in her lap as she follows the curve of the armhole. The silver fur of the sleeve begins to mingle with the silver fur of the shoulder. The garment is no longer a collection of parts. It is becoming a body. As she finishes the first shoulder, she holds the coat up. Even without the lining or the collar, it is magnificent. It has a presence, a weight, and a dignity that fills the small room. The fox fur seems to glow in the twilight, the silver tips catching the last of the firelight. She feels a deep, heavy exhaustion beginning to settle into her bones. Her fingers are slightly swollen from the pressure of the needles, and her eyes ache from the hours of focus. But the second sleeve must be set before she can rest. She cannot leave the garment half attached. The weight of the sleeve would pull on the unfinished seam and stretch the leather. She begins the second shoulder. The fog outside has turned to a fine, freezing drizzle that tinks against the window pane, a tiny metallic sound that highlights the silence of the room. Stitch, pull, rip, tug. She works by the light of the fire alone now, the orange glow casting long, dancing shadows across the silver fur. The rhythm of the work becomes a lullaby. The scent of the ash smoke, the feel of the waxed thread, the weight of the fox leather, all of it pulls her toward a state of semi-conscious peace. Finally, the last stitch is tied off. The great coat now has arms. Ilara lays the garment flat on the birch table, smoothing the sleeves out so they rest at the sides. It looks like a person sleeping. She takes a final look at her work, her heart full of a quiet, tired joy. The secret is almost complete. Only the lining of the sleeves and the great collar remain. She moves to the hearth, banks the ashwood coals for the night, and prepares to climb the ladder to her bed. The fog-drenched world outside is cold and indifferent, but here, under the roof of the croft, the warmth is growing, one stitch at a time. The dawn of the fourth day is not a rising of the sun, but a heavy, deepening of the white world. The fog of the previous evening has crystallized into a relentless, vertical fall of snow, flakes as large as goose feathers, drifting downward in a silent, hypnotic procession. They accumulate upon the thatched roof of the croft with a weight that is felt rather than heard, a gentle compression of the timber beams that seems to anchor the house more firmly into the frozen earth. Inside, the air is thick with the scent of dried lavender and the clean, sharp aroma of the ashwood fire. The temperature is a steady, encompassing warmth that creates a protective barrier against the infinite chill pressing against the stone walls. Ilara is back at her birch table. The great coat lies before her, its silver fox exterior now complete, its sleeves attached like the heavy limbs of a resting winter spirit. Today's work is perhaps the most sensory-rich part of the entire process, the lining of the sleeves. While the main body of the coat will be lined with the mosaic of rabbit squares she prepared earlier, The sleeves require a different approach to ensure that Thomas's arms can slide into them with effortless ease, even when he is wearing his thickest woolen tunics. She begins by selecting the finest, shortest-napped rabbit pelts from her remaining stock. These are the winter white furs, harvested when the rabbits are at their most plush. She lays them out on the table, their leather sides facing up. The leather of these specific pelts is as thin and supple as fine silk, yet it possesses a surprising resilience. She spends a long time simply smoothing the hides with her palms. Slide, press, slide. The sound is a dry, whispering friction, a tactile conversation between her skin and the ancient fibers of the hide. To line the sleeves, she must create 2 secondary cylinders of rabbit fur, which will then be inserted into the fox fur sleeves. This fur-on-fur construction creates a pocket of air between the 2 layers, an invisible chamber of insulation that will remain warm even if the outer temperature drops to 40 degrees below freezing. She picks up her applewood-handled blade and prepares to cut the rabbit hides into long, narrow strips. She takes her oilstone and begins the sharpening ritual once more. S-H-H-H chink, S-H-H-H chink, S-H-H-H chink. The rhythm is slower today, her movements more deliberate as she lets the repetitive sound pull her deeper into a state of calm. She watches a small bead of oil roll slowly across the stone, tracking its path until it is absorbed by the porous gray surface. She wipes the blade, the linen cloth making a soft scritch as it cleans the steel. She begins to cut. The strips must be exactly 4 inches wide. She uses her horn ruler to measure each one, marking the leather with a tiny, precise dot of charcoal. 4 inches, 8 inches, 12 inches. The numbers are a quiet mantra in her mind. As she draws the blade through the rabbit leather, the sound is a faint, silken sigh. The strips fall away from the main pelt like ribbons of cream. She collects the strips and begins to join them. For this, she returns to her ivory-colored silk thread. She takes the block of amber beeswax and draws the silk through it. Z-Z-Z-zip, Z-Z-Z-zip, Z-Z-Z-zip. The sound is a delicate, high-pitched hum that seems to hang in the air for a second after she finishes. She threads her finest needle, the one with the eye so small it is almost invisible to the naked eye. She must hold it up against the bright, white light, reflecting off the snow outside to see the opening. The stitching begins. She uses a flat-felled seam for the lining strips, ensuring that there are no raised ridges that could catch on Thomas's clothing. Each stitch is a tiny, microscopic anchor. Stitch, pull, tink, stitch, pull, tink. The tink is the sound of the needle hitting her bone thimble. It is a rhythmic, percussive heartbeat that marks the passage of the morning. She works with her head bowed, her focus so narrow that she is aware only of the 3 millimeters of leather directly beneath her needle. She notices the way the silk thread, coated in wax, has a slight translucency, looking like a strand of frozen water as it binds the hides together. As she completes the first lining cylinder, she pauses. The room is so quiet that she can hear the soft thump of her own heart and the distant, rhythmic whir of the wind as it passes over the chimney. She picks up the finished rabbit fur tube. It is weightless, a ghost of a sleeve. She turns it right side out, and the white fur explodes outward in a cloud of softness. She runs her hand through the center of the tube. It feels like reaching into a warm, sunlit cloud. Now comes the delicate act of insertion. She takes the heavy, silver fox sleeve and opens the wrist. She carefully slides the white rabbit lining inside. As they change. The sound of fur sliding against fur is one of the most hypnotic sounds in the world. It is a low, muffled rustle, like the sound of dry leaves moving under a deep layer of snow. She uses a long wooden dowel to push the lining all the way up to the shoulder, ensuring that it lies perfectly flat against the internal leather of the fox pelt. She spends nearly an hour on this single task, reaching her hand inside the sleeve to feel for any bunches, any twists, or any folds in the rabbit fur. Feel smooth, adjust, feel smooth, adjust. The tactile feedback is her only guide. She moves her fingers along the entire length of the arm, from the shoulder joint to the cuff. She can feel the dense, oily guard hairs of the fox on one side and the downy, silken undercoat of the rabbit on the other. It is a symphony of textures, a hidden luxury that only the wearer will ever truly know. Once the lining is positioned perfectly, she must secure it at the wrist. This is done with a blind stitch or a ladder stitch, where the needle travels between the two layers of leather, appearing only for a fraction of a second to catch a single fiber of the hide. This ensures that when Thomas looks at the cuff, he sees no thread, only the transition from silver fur to white. Insert, slide, pull, insert, slide, pull. She works her way around the circumference of the wrist. It is a circle of 32 stitches. She counts them as she goes, her voice a low, rhythmic murmur. 28, 29, 30, 31, 32. She ties off the final knot, burying it deep within the fur where it will never be felt. She then repeats the entire process for the second sleeve. The strips, the sharpening, the waxing, the stitching, the insertion, the smoothing, the blind stitching. The repetition is not tiring. It is a structural necessity, a way of ensuring that both sides of the garment are imbued with the same level of care and attention. The afternoon begins to wane. The white light of the snow glare turns to a soft, dusty gold as the sun, though hidden by the storm, moves toward the horizon. Elara stops to eat a small bowl of thick root vegetable pottage that has been simmering on a stone near the fire. The steam from the bowl smells of parsnips, leeks, and dried thyme. She eats slowly, the wooden spoon making a soft clack against the ceramic bowl. The warmth of the food spreads through her chest, a mirrored heat to the fire at her side. After her meal, she decides to perform a task that requires less visual focus but more tactile precision: the sorting of the toggles. For a coat this heavy, buttons of wood or bone would be too fragile. She has chosen to use toggles carved from the antlers of a red deer, shed in the forest during the previous spring. She retrieves a small leather pouch and pours the toggles onto the birch table. Clatter, clink, roll. The sound of the antler pieces hitting the wood is bright and musical. There are 6 toggles in total, each about 3 inches long, tapered at the ends and drilled with 2 holes in the center. She picks them up one by one, feeling their weight and their temperature. Antler is a strange material. It feels like stone, yet it holds a warmth that stone never could. She takes a small piece of fine grit sandstone and begins to polish the edges of the toggles. Scritch, scratch, scritch, scratch. She wants them to be perfectly smooth, so that the leather loops of the coat will slide over them without catching. She focuses on the grain of the antler, noticing the tiny, dark speckles and the creamy, ivory-colored marrow at the core. She spends 10 minutes on each toggle, turning it over in her hands, checking for any roughness, any sharp edges. Polish feel, Polish feel. The monotony of the task is deeply soothing. The fire has settled into a rhythmic pulse of orange light, and the shadows in the room have grown long and soft. The snow continues to fall outside, a white curtain that has completely isolated the croft from the rest of the world. There is no one to disturb her, no one to see the secret work. She places the 6 polished toggles in a neat row at the top of the table. They look like a row of small, pale bones, ready to be called into service. Beside them, she places a length of thick, braided rawhide, the material she will use for the loops. The rawhide is stiff and dark, smelling of salt and smoke. She will need to soak it in warm water before she can work with it, but that is a task for tomorrow. She returns her attention to the great coat. She lifts it from the table and drapes it over her own shoulders for a moment, just to feel the progress. The weight is substantial now, a comforting, heavy embrace that blocks out every draft in the room. The rabbit-lined sleeves hang heavily at her sides, their interiors a secret world of softness. She can feel the warmth of her own body being reflected back at her by the fox fur, a feedback loop of heat that makes her feel invincible against the winter. She stands there for a few minutes, eyes closed, listening to the silence. The house feels like it is breathing with her. The creak of the timber, the sigh of the fire, the rustle of the furs. It is a language of safety. She feels a profound sense of gratitude for these materials, for the animals that provided the fur, for the trees that provided the heat, and for the skill in her hands that allows her to weave them all together. She lays the coat back on the table, smoothing the silver fur one last time. She moves to the hearth and adds a final log of ash wood, watching as the flames wrap around it in a slow, orange dance. She banks the coals, the shovel making a soft, shushing sound in the ash. The oil lamp is flickering, the wick drawing the last of the tallow. She blows out the lamp, and the room is instantly filled with the deep, red glow of the embers. The white world outside is gone, replaced by the textured darkness of the interior. She moves toward the ladder, her feet finding the warm stones near the hearth. The work of the sleeves is done. The toggles are ready. The secret is growing, a fortress of warmth waiting for the man who will wear it. The 5th morning of the secret creation arrives with a silence so absolute it feels as though the entire world has been submerged beneath a sea of white velvet. The heavy snowfall of the previous night has reached the midpoint of the small, deep-set window, effectively sealing the croft from the external world. The light that filters through the ice and the pressed snow is a soft, diffused blue-white, a ghostly luminescence that illuminates the weaving chamber without casting a single harsh shadow. It is a morning of profound isolation and safety, where the boundaries of the universe are defined by the 4 stone walls, the heat of the hearth, and the silver garment resting upon the birch table. Ilara wakes slowly, her consciousness rising through layers of warmth like a bubble in honey. She remains in the loft for a long time, listening. There is no sound from the sheep in the barn, no sound of wind in the chimney, only the rhythmic, steady pulse of her own life. Thomas will not be returning today. The storm has seen to that. He will be sheltered in the lower shepherd's hut, safe and warm, waiting for the sky to clear. This gives Ilara a full, uninterrupted day to complete the most important architectural feature of the great coat, the high collar. She descends the ladder, her feet finding the familiar, smooth stone of the floor. The embers in the hearth are deep and ruby red, glowing with a persistent, ancient energy. She does not rush to build a roaring fire. Instead, she adds 3 large logs of seasoned white oak. Oak burns with a heavy, slow dignity, producing a heat that is felt in the marrow of the bones. As the wood catches, it releases a scent of deep forest, of rain-soaked earth, and the dry, noble aroma of time itself. She watches as the first blue flames lick around the bark, a slow-motion dance of transformation. She moves to the birch table and prepares a simple breakfast of warm goat's milk and a thick slice of rye bread, toasted on a flat stone near the fire. She eats with a deliberate slowness, savoring the crunch of the toasted grain and the creamy, earthy sweetness of the milk. Each movement is a preparation for the mental and physical focus required for the day's task. Once finished, she clears the table, wipes the surface with a damp linen cloth, and brings the great coat into the center of the workspace. The collar is not merely a piece of fabric. It is a fortress for the neck and the lower face. In the brutal highlands, the wind seeks out any gap, any vulnerability, and it is the collar's duty to repel the frost. Ilara has saved the most magnificent pelts for this purpose. 2 prime silver fox hides with exceptionally long, dense guard hairs, and 4 smaller rabbit pelts of a thickness that feels like sheared lamb's wool. She begins by creating the core of the collar. Because a fur collar of this size would naturally flop or sag, it requires an internal skeleton. She reaches into her supply chest and retrieves a piece of heavyweight linen canvas, a fabric so stiff it can almost stand on its own. It has been woven with a double warp and double weft, creating a grid of immense strength. She lays the linen onto the birch table and takes her horn ruler. She measures a long, curved rectangle, tapering slightly at the ends where the collar will meet the front panels of the coat. 12 inches in length, 4 inches in height at the back, 3 inches at the front. She marks the lines with her charcoal sliver, scritch, scritch. The sound is dry and dusty, a tactile contrast to the softness of the furs. She then takes her applewood-handled blade and begins the cutting. The linen is tough, requiring a firm, steady pressure. The sound of the blade parting the heavy threads is a rhythmic snip-crunch, snip-crunch. It is a sound of structural integrity, of building something meant to endure for decades. Once the linen core is cut, she must pad it. This is a secret technique passed down through her family. She takes several handfuls of raw, carded sheep's wool, wool that still contains its natural lanolin oils. She begins to felt the wool onto the linen. She uses a small, barbed needle of iron, punching it repeatedly through the wool and into the linen canvas. Tag, 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 tag. The sound is rapid and percussive, like a tiny woodpecker at work. With each punch of the needle, the fibers of the wool become entangled with the weave of the linen, creating a dense, cushioned layer that is both warm and firm. She spends nearly 2 hours on this task, ensuring the wool is evenly distributed across the entire surface of the collar. As she works, she notices the way the lanolin from the wool begins to coat her fingers, making her skin feel soft and supple. The smell of the raw wool is comforting. It smells of the hills, of rain, and of the animals she and Thomas have tended for so many years. She closes her eyes for a moment, letting the rhythmic tack-tack-tack of the needle guide her thoughts into a state of hypnotic calm. The world outside is a white void, but here she is building a landscape of warmth. Once the padded core is finished, she turns her attention to the outer fur. She takes the two silver fox pelts and aligns them so that the ruff, the part with the longest, most dramatic guard hairs, will sit at the very top of the collar, framing the face. She spends a long time grooming these pelts. Scritch, scritch, scritch. The bronze-bristled brush moves through the silver fur, removing every microscopic tangle. The fur is so dense that the brush leaves behind a temporary path, a furrow in the silver sea that slowly fills back in as the hairs settle. She cuts the fox fur to match the dimensions of the linen core, adding a half-inch allowance on all sides so the fur can be wrapped around the edges. The sound of the blade through the fox leather is a deep, satisfying thrum. She sets the fur pieces aside and prepares her thread. Today, she uses a triple strand of waxed linen thread for the attachment of the collar. She pulls the thread through the amber beeswax. Zzzz-zip, zzzz-zip, zzzz-zip. The sound is heavier now, more resonant. She threads her largest Glover's needle, the triangular point gleaming in the soft, diffused light of the snow-blocked window. The assembly of the collar is a slow, multi-layered process. First, she sews the rabbit fur lining to the inner side of the padded linen core. This is the side that will touch Thomas's skin. She uses a running stitch that is invisible from the front. Stitch, pull, rip, stitch, pull, rip. The sound of the needle passing through the rabbit leather, the wool padding, and the heavy linen is a complex acoustic event. It is a heavy sound, a sound of mass and density. She feels the resistance of the layers, the way the needle requires a precise, forceful push from her leather-shielded palm. She works with a steady, unhurried rhythm, her breath syncing with the entry and exit of the steel. Inhale as the needle enters. Exhale as the thread pulls tight. She notices the way the room has grown even quieter as the snow continues to pile up outside the window. The blue-white light is beginning to fade into a soft, pearlescent gray. The oak logs in the hearth have settled into a state of glowing equilibrium, the heat radiating in steady, invisible waves that make the air feel thick and nurturing. After finishing the inner lining, she flips the collar over and attaches the silver fox outer shell. This is the face of the collar. She wraps the edges of the fox fur around the linen core, tucking them neatly under the rabbit fur. She uses a whip stitch to join the two furs at the edge. Loop, pull, sink, loop, pull, sink. The transition from the silver fox to the white rabbit at the edge of the collar is beautiful. It looks like a line of frost on a granite ledge. She spends nearly an hour on this edge alone, ensuring that the stitches are perfectly tensioned. If they are too tight, the collar will pucker. If they are too loose, the fur will gap and let in the wind. She uses her bone pick to tease out any hairs that have been caught in the stitches, restoring the fluffiness of the ruff. The collar is now a complete, heavy object. It has a weight that is surprising, a physical presence that suggests total protection. Ilara picks it up and bends it into a circle. The padded core allows it to hold its shape perfectly. She imagines Thomas turning up this collar against a northern gale, his face buried in the silver fur, his breath creating a tiny microclimate of warmth. Now comes the final, most structural act of the day, attaching the completed collar to the neckline of the great coat. This is the crown of the garment. She positions the collar against the heavy back and front panels. She uses 4 long iron tacking pins to hold the massive assembly in place. The weight of the coat is now significant. As she moves it on the table, the birch wood groans slightly, a low wooden protest that adds to the sensory tapestry of the room. She begins the final seam. This requires her to sew through the fox outer of the coat, the linen stay tape of the neckline, and the triple-layered construction of the collar itself. It is a monumental task for a needle. Push, grunt, vrip, push, grunt, vrip. Each stitch is an act of strength. She uses her entire arm to drive the needle home, the steel popping as it shears through the multiple layers of hide and canvas. The sound is loud in the silence of the room, a rhythmic, mechanical punctuation. She works from the center of the back toward the left front, then returns to the center and works toward the right. This ensures the collar is perfectly centered. 1 inch, 2 inches, 3 inches. The progress is slow, almost glacial. She doesn't mind. In the heart of a winter storm, there is nowhere else to be, nothing else to do. This is the ultimate expression of her role as a maker, the slow, persistent construction of safety. She watches the way the wax thread creates a series of tiny, glistening V shapes along the interior of the neckline, a hidden pattern of strength. As she reaches the final 3 inches of the seam, the light in the room has turned to a deep, velvety violet. The snow outside has completely covered the window now, and the only light comes from the hearth. The oak logs are glowing with a fierce, orange intensity, casting long, flickering shadows that dance across the silver fur of the coat. She ties off the final knot of the collar. It is a massive, triple-knotted anchor of waxed linen. She buries the ends of the thread deep within the wool padding. The great coat is now structurally complete. It has a body, arms, and a towering collar. It lies on the birch table like a dormant creature, a silver and white monument to 5 days of quiet, monotonous labor. Ilara stands and stretches her body, her joints popping in the silence. She feels a profound sense of relief, a heavy, contented exhaustion that settles over her like a blanket. She spends the final hour of her day in a state of quiet observation. She takes her grooming brush and performs a final, celebratory grooming of the entire garment. Scritch, scritch, scritch. She brushes the back, the sleeves, and finally the magnificent ruff of the collar. The fur responds to her touch, shimmering in the firelight, the silver tips catching the orange glow of the oak embers. She thinks about the logistics of the finishing touches, the toggles and the rawhide loops. That will be the work of the 6th day. For now, the heavy lifting is done. The fortress is built. She moves to the hearth and adds one final, massive log of oak. She banks the ash around it, ensuring it will burn until the morning. The heat in the room is a physical weight, a warm embrace that pulls at her eyelids. She extinguishes the small oil lamp, leaving the room in the rhythmic red pulse of the fire. She climbs the ladder to the loft, her mind a peaceful blank. The snow continues to fall, the world remains silent, and the great coat waits on the table, a secret of silver and warmth in the heart of the Highland night. The sixth day of the hidden labor dawns with a brilliance that is almost startling after the days of gray mist and indigo twilight. The storm has finally exhausted itself, leaving behind a world that has been sculpted into new, unrecognizable shapes by the wind. The snow outside the croft has drifted as high as the eaves in some places, and the morning sun, though pale and distant, reflects off the frozen crust with a crystalline intensity that makes the eyes water. Inside the weaving chamber, this reflected light pours through the small window, filling the room with a cold, white clarity that reveals every microscopic fiber of the silver fox fur and every grain in the birch table. Ilara remains within the quiet sanctuary of the house. Though the sky is clear, the paths will be impassable for another day, ensuring her solitude. The hearth today is fed with birch logs. Birch burns with a bright, cheerful flame and a gentle, papery crackle, releasing a scent that is crisp and slightly sweet, like the memory of a spring forest. It provides a clean, even light that is perfect for the meticulous task of adding the closures, the toggles and the loops that will transform the garment from a collection of fur panels into a functional shield against the world. She begins with the rawhide. She retrieves a large ceramic bowl from the pantry, its surface a deep, earthy brown. She fills it with lukewarm water from a kettle that has been resting near the fire. Glug, glug, glug. The sound of the water is heavy and melodic in the silence of the room. She then takes the length of braided rawhide she prepared previously, a stiff, dark cord that looks like a dried vine, and gently submerges it in the water. She watches as the water begins to work its magic. Tiny air bubbles rise from the surface of the rawhide, clinging to the bowl's edge like liquid pearls. She spends nearly half an hour simply watching this process, the slow softening of the hide. She reaches into the bowl and runs her thumb along the cord. At first, it is as hard as bone, but gradually it begins to yield, becoming supple and slightly slippery. The smell of the wet rawhide is primal and salt-tinged, a scent of the sea and the earth combined. While the rawhide soaks, she returns to the great coat to mark the placement of the closures. This is a task of geometric precision. She lays the coat flat, the two front panels overlapping slightly at the center. She takes her horn ruler and her sliver of charcoal. The first toggle, 6 inches below the collar. The second toggle, 5 inches below the first. The third, fourth, fifth, and sixth, each spaced exactly 5 inches apart. She marks the spots with a tiny X on the leather side of the fox pelt. She then checks the symmetry. She moves to the other side of the opening and marks the corresponding spots for the loops. She measures twice, then a third time. 1 inch, 5 inches, 10 inches. The numbers are a silent cadence. She uses a bone square to ensure the lines are perfectly horizontal. If one toggle is even a fraction of an inch higher than its loop, the coat will pull and gather, creating a gap where the cold can enter. Once the markings are complete, she retrieves the rawhide from the water. It is now as flexible as silk ribbon. She wipes the excess moisture away with a linen cloth, leaving the hide damp but not dripping. She cuts the cord into 12-inch lengths, one for each loop. Now begins the braiding. Even though the cord is already a simple braid, she wants to create a triple twist for the loops to ensure they never stretch or snap. She sits in her chair, the light of the birch fire catching the movement of her fingers. Left over center, right over center, left over center, right over center. The movement is rhythmic and hypnotic. The damp rawhide makes a soft, squelching sound as she pulls the braid tight, a tactile, wet friction that is oddly satisfying. She focuses on the tension of each twist. Every loop must be identical in its thickness and its resilience. She spends 10 minutes on each of the 6 loops, her hands moving with the steady, unhurried pace of a clock. As she finishes a loop, she forms it into a teardrop shape and ties the ends with a temporary thread. She lays them in a row on the table. They look like small, dark artifacts. They will need to dry slightly before they are sewn onto the coat, as the leather will shrink and tighten as it loses its moisture, creating a permanent, rock-hard structure. She turns her attention to the attachment of the antler toggles. These are the 6 pieces of polished deer antler she prepared on the 4th day. To attach them, she requires attachment tabs, small, circular patches of the honey-colored deer hide that will act as reinforcements between the toggle and the fox fur. She cuts 12 of these circles, each about the size of a large coin. She uses a small, hollow bone punch to create 2 holes in the center of each circle. Tap, tap, tap. The sound of the mallet hitting the punch is sharp and clean, echoing off the stone walls. Now she prepares her needle and thread. For the toggles, she uses a double strand of the heaviest waxed linen thread she possesses. She pulls it through the beeswax block. Zzz-zip, zzz-zip, zzz-zip. The sound is a familiar anchor, a reminder of the thousands of stitches that have already gone into this garment. She begins the attachment. She places a deer hide tab on the fur side of the coat and another on the leather side, sandwiching the fox pelt between them. She Arabic scene passes the needle through all 3 layers, then through the holes in the antler toggle and back down again. Push, pull, rip, push, pull, rip. Because she is sewing through such dense materials, she must use her leather palm guard. The resistance is significant. She feels the needle groan slightly as it passes through the hard antler and the tough deer hide. She makes 12 passes for each toggle, creating a bridge of thread that is nearly as thick as the rawhide cord itself. 1 toggle secured, 2 toggles secured. The weight of the coat shifts in her lap as she moves from one marking to the next. The silver fur is so thick that the deer hide tabs are almost entirely hidden, buried within the silver forest. Only the pale, ivory-colored antler is visible, sitting like a small, smooth stone upon the surface of the fur. She tests the first toggle, pulling on it with her full strength. It does not budge. It is a part of the coat's very skeleton now. The afternoon light begins to shift, the brilliant white of the morning turning into a soft, hazy gold as the sun sinks toward the jagged peaks of the mountains. The birch logs have burned down to a pile of glowing, orange coals, and the room is filled with a steady, dry heat. Ilara stops to drink a bowl of cool water, the liquid tasting of the earth and the stone. She watches the way the light catches the polished surface of the antler toggles, creating tiny, brilliant glints of gold. Now that the rawhide loops have dried to a leathery consistency, she begins the process of attaching them to the opposite panel. This is identical to the toggle attachment, using the deerhide tabs for reinforcement. The teardrop of the rawhide loop is positioned so that it extends exactly 1 inch past the edge of the coat. Push-pull, rip, push-pull, rip. She works with a focused monotony. The rhythm of the needle, the smell of the birch smoke, the feel of the drying rawhide, it all blends into a single, seamless experience of creation. She is aware of the passage of time only through the changing color of the light on the floor. By the time she reaches the final loop, the room is bathed in the deep, warm violet of the evening. She ties off the last knot, her fingers moving with a slow, tired grace. She then performs the first closing of the coat. She slides the top antler toggle through the top rawhide loop. Click. The sound of the antler hitting the dried rawhide is a sharp, musical note, the sound of a job well done. She continues down the front of the coat. Click, 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 click. The 6 toggles are all secured. The coat is now a closed vessel, a solid wall of silver and white that would repel the most vicious of winter storms. She stands up and lifts the coat. It is incredibly heavy now, the weight of the fox fur, the rabbit lining, the linen core, the deerhide pockets, and the antler closures all combining into a singular, formidable mass. She drapes it over the back of a heavy oak chair and steps back to look at it. In the dying light, the great coat looks like a living thing. The silver fur shimmers with a spectral light, and the white rabbit lining at the collar and cuffs provides a brilliant contrast. The antler toggles look like the buttons of a king's mantle. It is more than she had hoped for. It is a masterpiece of hidden care, a fortress built of silk and leather and bone. She has one final task for the day, the hem. The bottom edge of the coat is currently raw, meaning the leather and fur are simply cut. To prevent the edge from fraying or picking up moisture from the snow, she must bind it. For this, she uses a long 2-inch wide strip of the dark, old-tanned leather she has been saving. She lays the coat back on the table, bottom side up. She takes the leather binding and begins to fold it over the edge of the fur and leather. She secures it with small, bone, clamping pins. The binding will provide a durable skirt for the coat, protecting the more delicate fox fur from the abrasion of the snow and the wearer's boots. The sewing of the hem is a marathon of small, identical stitches. There are over 4 feet of edge to cover. She picks up her needle and a fresh length of waxed linen. Stitch, pull, rip, stitch, pull, rip. The sound becomes a lullaby once again. The room is dark now, save for the red glow of the birch embers. She works by feel, her fingers guiding the needle along the edge of the leather binding. She notices the way her own breath creates a tiny, rhythmic puff of steam in the cool air away from the fire. She decides to finish the hem tonight, no matter how long it takes. The monotony is her friend. It keeps her mind from wandering to the cold outside, from thinking about the isolation of the storm. She focuses entirely on the 3 millimeters between the stitches. 1 foot of hem, 2 feet. The world shrinks to the size of her needle. The sounds of the night, the creak of the frost-bound timber, the distant, muffled owl call, the sigh of the fire, are merely the background music to her industry. Finally, as the moon begins to rise over the snow-clogged mountains, casting a silver light through the top of the window, she reaches the end of the binding. She joins the two ends of the leather strip with a reinforced box stitch and ties off the final knot of the day. The hem is finished. The toggles are secure. The loops are hard. The great coat is complete in its structure. All that remains is the final inspection and the seasoning of the leather. Ilara moves to the hearth and banks the birch coals. She covers them with a thick layer of ash, leaving only a tiny, glowing eye of fire to watch over the room. She moves to the oak chair and runs her hand over the silver fur of the coat one last time. It is cold to the touch now, but she knows the warmth it holds within. She climbs the ladder to the loft, her body feeling as light as air now that the heavy work is done. The silence of the highlands is profound, a deep, frozen peace that matches the stillness in her own heart. The secret is nearly ready. The winter is half over, and the sleep when it comes is a dreamless, silver void. The seventh day of the secret labor begins with a clarity that feels almost crystalline, as if the very air inside the croft has been distilled by the intense cold lingering beyond the stone walls. The sun has risen into a sky of pale, unblemished sapphire, casting long, sharp-edged rectangles of brilliant white light across the birch table and the stone floor. This is the day of the great inspection, the quiet, slow-motion ritual where every stitch, every seam, and every fiber of the garment is held up to the light of the sun and the scrutiny of the senses. There is no longer any sound of the blade or the punch. The air is filled only with the soft, rhythmic rustle of fur and the steady, grounding hum of the fire. Ilara begins her morning not with work, but with the preparation of the room. She adds 2 large logs of seasoned applewood to the hearth. Applewood burns with a sweet, delicate fragrance and a flame that is more golden than orange, providing a gentle warmth that does not overwhelm the senses. As the wood catches, a scent like dried blossoms and toasted sugar fills the air, mingling with the earthy, resinous smell of the fox furs. She moves to the window and uses a small wooden scraper to clear a larger patch of frost, allowing the full strength of the winter sun to illuminate her workspace. The great coat lies on the table, a monumental landscape of silver and white. Ilara begins at the top, the massive ruff of the silver fox collar. She picks up her bone pick, a slender, polished tool made from the wing bone of a swan. She uses the point of the pick to trace every single inch of the seam where the collar meets the body. Trace, lift, inspect, trace, lift, inspect. The sound of the bone pick against the leather is a dry, whispering click-clack, a sound that marks her progress around the circumference of the neck. She is looking for trapped hairs, those tiny, silver-guard hairs that may have been caught in the waxed linen thread during the sewing. When she finds one, she gently teases it free, watching as the hair springs back into its natural position, adding to the fluffiness of the ruff. She spends nearly an hour on the collar alone, her eyes less than 3 inches from the fur, her world reduced to a few millimeters of silver and thread. Once the collar is perfect, she moves to the shoulders. She runs her palms over the seams where the sleeves join the body. This is a tactile inspection. She is feeling for any lumps, any unevenness in the internal padding, or any place where the thread might be under too much tension. She finds a small area near the left shoulder where the leather feels slightly stiff. She does not reach for a tool. Instead, she uses the warmth of her own hands. She cups the leather, pressing her palms against the hide and holding them there for several minutes. The heat from her skin transfers to the oiled leather and the beeswax on the thread, softening the materials until they become supple. She then begins to massage the seam, a slow, circular motion of her thumbs. Rub, knead, smooth. The sound of the leather moving against itself is a low, muffled creak, a sound of structural flexibility. She continues this for 20 minutes until the seam feels as soft as the surrounding hide. Next, she turns the coat inside out. The brilliant white world of the rabbit fur lining is revealed, glowing with an internal light in the sunshine. She begins the same inspection process for the interior. She traces the grid of the 16 rabbit squares, her fingers following the path of the silk thread. Silk fur, silk fur. The texture of the rabbit fur is so light that it feels almost like air against her fingertips. She notices the way the sun catches the individual white hairs, creating a shimmering effect like light on a field of fresh snow. She checks the internal pockets, the deer-hide sanctuaries she sewed on the third day. She reaches her hand deep into each pocket, feeling the strength of the cross-stitched corners. She places a small, polished river stone into the right pocket to test the hang. The coat absorbs the weight effortlessly, the silver fox fur barely rippling under the load. After the inspection comes the most meditative task of the day, the seasoning. Even though the pelts were cured and oiled before she began, the process of sewing and handling has dried the leather in certain areas. To ensure the coat remains waterproof and supple for a lifetime, she must apply a final, restorative layer of life oil. She retrieves a small soapstone bowl from the hearth, where it has been warming near the coals. Inside is a mixture she prepared weeks ago: 2 parts rendered mink oil, 1 part clear linseed oil, and a small spoonful of melted pine resin. The mixture is translucent and amber-colored, smelling of the deep woods and the wild. She takes a piece of soft, undyed sheep's wool, the dauber, and dips it into the warm oil. Dip, drip, press. She begins at the hem of the coat on the leather side of the fox pelts. She applies the oil in long, slow, overlapping strokes. Shloosh, slide, shloosh, slide. The sound is wet and rhythmic, a tactile melody that fills the silent room. She watches as the pale tan leather drinks in the oil, turning a deep, rich mahogany color as the moisture penetrates the fibers. She works with extreme patience. She does not apply the oil to the entire coat at once. She works in small, 4-inch squares. Apply the oil, wait for 60 seconds, buff the area with a dry linen cloth, move to the next square. The buffing process makes a soft, rhythmic swish-swish sound. The friction generates a tiny amount of heat, which helps the oil sink deeper into the hide. Ilara's arm moves in a steady, mechanical arc, back and forth, back and forth. She notices the way the leather begins to take on a dull, healthy sheen, a glow that suggests durability and life. She spends 2 hours on the back panel alone, her focus entirely on the absorption rate of the hide. As she works, she thinks about the logistics of the coat's future. She imagines Thomas wearing it in the high pastures, the oil she is applying now repelling the sleet and the melting frost. She imagines the leather growing softer with every year of use, eventually conforming to the exact shape of his shoulders and the curve of his back. This oiling is an act of preservation, a way of ensuring that her work outlives the winter, and perhaps even outlives the decade. The sun begins to move across the room, the rectangles of light shifting from the table to the stone floor. The applewood fire has settled into a bed of glowing, white-capped coals, the scent of the wood becoming more concentrated and savory. Ilara pauses to eat a small piece of honey cake and drink a cup of warmed ale. The sweetness of the honey and the bitterness of the ale provide a sensory reset, a brief interlude in the long, oily labor of the afternoon. She returns to the coat, now focusing on the sleeves. The cylinders of fur are more difficult to oil, requiring her to reach inside the garment and work by feel. She applies the oil to the internal leather of the sleeves, ensuring that the areas around the elbows, the points of maximum movement, are especially well saturated. Slide press, rub, slide press, rub. The sound inside the sleeve is muffled and echoing, a hollow thrum that vibrates through her arm. She takes her time, ensuring that no oil touches the white rabbit fur of the lining. This requires the precision of a surgeon, her hand moving with a slow, controlled grace. She uses a small wooden spatula to apply the oil to the tight corners of the armpits and the collar joins. Once the oiling is complete, she leaves the coat draped over the birch table to set in the afternoon sun. The heat from the window and the warmth of the room will help the oil distribute itself evenly through the leather. She stands back and watches the garment. In the bright light, the mahogany leather and the silver fur look like an altar of winter craft. The smell of the mink oil and pine resin is thick and comforting, a scent of absolute readiness. She spends the final hours of the daylight on the final grooming. She takes her finest brush, the one with soft badger hair bristles, and begins to work on the fur side of the entire coat. This is not about removing tangles, it is about lofting. She brushes against the grain of the fur, lifting the guard hairs so that air can circulate through the undercoat. Then, with a single long stroke, she smooths the fur back down. Brush up, whisper down, brush up, whisper down. The sound is a series of soft shhshh noises, like the sound of wind in the dry grass. She starts at the bottom of the coat and works her way up to the collar. She watches the way the silver fox fur reacts to the brush, how it ripples like water, how the silver tips catch the fading sunlight, and how the density of the coat seems to increase as it is lofted. She spends nearly 40 minutes on the sleeves, ensuring the fur flows perfectly from the shoulder to the wrist. She then turns her attention to the white rabbit fur of the cuffs and the collar. This fur is so fine that the badger hair brush makes no sound at all. It is a silent, visual transformation. The white becomes more brilliant, more cloud-like, a stark and beautiful contrast to the dark, oiled leather and the silver-gray fox. As the sun begins to dip below the horizon, turning the sky into a palette of bruised orange and dusty gold, Ilara performs the final check of the toggles. She undoes each antler toggle and refastens it. Click, 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 click. The sound of the antler against the now hardened rawhide loops is melodic and final. The closures are perfect. The coat is ready. She lifts the garment from the table. It is at its maximum weight now, the leather heavy with the restorative oils. She carries it to a sturdy wooden peg near the hearth, where it will hang for the night. As the coat settles on the peg, the fur rustles with a deep, muffled sound, like a large bird settling its wings. The seventh day is drawing to a close. The secret labor is essentially finished. Tomorrow, the eighth day, will be the day of the transition, the preparation for the moment when the coat is no longer a secret, but a gift. Ilara moves to the hearth and adds a final, thick log of applewood. She banks the coals, the shovel making a soft, metallic clink against the stone. The room is filled with the deep red glow of the fire, the scent of the mink oil, and the silence of a world that is finally at peace. She climbs the ladder to her bed, her mind quiet, her hands smelling of pine and honey. The great coat hangs below, a silver sentinel in the darkness, waiting for the man it was made to protect. The final night of the secret work is a study in absolute, breathless stillness. The world outside the stone walls of the croft has reached a point of thermal equilibrium, where the air is so cold that the very molecules of the atmosphere seem to have slowed their dance. The moon, a cold and silver disk, hangs suspended in a sky of obsidian, casting a light so sharp and clinical that it turns the snow-covered highlands into a landscape of polished bone and charcoal shadows. Inside, the fire in the hearth has been reduced to a single, pulsing heart of oak and applewood, glowing with a deep, infrared intensity that warms the air without disturbing the silence. The scent of the room is a complex, layered tapestry. The sweet, lingering ghost of the applewood smoke, the resinous tang of the pine oil, the musk of the fox fur, and the clean, starchy aroma of the linen shroud waiting on the chair. Ilara sits in the darkness for a long time, her eyes fixed on the great coat as it hangs from its wooden peg. In the dim, red light, the silver fur seems to hold a life of its own, shimmering with every microscopic movement of the air. This is the final hour of her solitude. Tomorrow, the sun will rise on the solstice, and the secret will pass from her hands to Thomas's. She feels no rush to reach that moment. Instead, she savors the weight of the accomplishment, the way the silence of the house feels heavy and earned. She rises from her stool, her movements slow and deliberate, and begins the final logistical task, the tidying of the tools. She moves to the birch table, which has been her altar of industry for 10 days. She picks up the small, bone-handled brush and begins to sweep the surface. Shhhshh. Shhhshh. The sound of the bristles against the wood is a soft, rhythmic whisper. She gathers the tiny fragments of silver and white fur, the angel's dust of her craft, and carefully places them into a small linen pouch. These scraps are too small for sewing, but they are precious. She will use them to stuff a small, warm heart pillow for the cradle, or perhaps to line a tinder box. She notices a single, silver guard hair caught in a groove of the wood. She lifts it with her tweezers, observing its tapering length under the firelight before letting it join the others. Next, she addresses the needles. One by one, she retrieves them from the green velvet cushion. She examines each tip for any sign of dullness or a microscopic burr. She takes a small piece of fine emery cloth and gives each needle a final, celebratory polish. Z-zip, z-zip, z-zip. The sound is high-pitched and metallic, a sharp punctuation in the quiet room. She coats each needle in a thin film of tallow to protect it from the damp of the coming spring and returns them to their boxwood case. The lid closes with a dry, wooden thud, a sound of finality. She then gathers the spools of waxed linen and silk thread, the blocks of beeswax, and the antler-handled blades, arranging them in her sewing chest with the precision of a jeweler. Everything has its place. The chaos of creation has been resolved into the order of completion. Now comes the folding of the gift. This is a task that requires the same level of focus as the stitching itself. A fur garment of this magnitude cannot be folded haphazardly. It must be handled with a deep understanding of its internal structure. Ilara clears the birch table entirely, wiping it down one last time until the wood gleams. She lifts the great coat from its peg. The weight is substantial, a heavy, reassuring mass in her arms. She lays it flat on the table, fur side down, the mahogany-oiled leather facing the ceiling. She begins by smoothing out the back panel. Her hands move from the neck down to the hem in wide, rhythmic arcs. Slide, press, slide. She ensures that every inch of the leather is flat, every seam resting in its natural position. She then takes the left sleeve and folds it across the back. Vuff. The sound of the fox fur meeting the oiled leather is a soft, compressed sigh. She ensures the sleeve is perfectly horizontal, the cuff resting just below the opposite armhole. She repeats the motion with the right sleeve, crossing it over the left. The coat now forms a compact silver and brown rectangle. She then takes the bottom hem and folds it upward by 1/3, then another third, until the garment is a thick, heavy square of warmth. She presses down on the stack with the palms of her hands, feeling the air escape from the dense layers of fur and wool. Hiss-des-des. It is the sound of the coat settling into its final shape. She retrieves the solstice shroud, a large, rectangular piece of heavy, unbleached linen that she has spent the last year weaving. The linen is cool and crisp, smelling of the lavender she dried in the autumn and tucked between the folds of the fabric. She spreads the linen over the folded coat, tucking the edges underneath with a series of precise, tucking motions. Tuck smooth, tuck smooth. The coat is now a linen-wrapped mystery, sitting in the center of the table like a large white stone. To secure the package, she uses a length of braided wool cord, dyed a deep, earthy crimson with the juice of crushed madder roots. She wraps the cord around the linen shroud, tying it with a simple, elegant bow. She spends several minutes adjusting the loops of the bow until they are perfectly symmetrical. The crimson cord against the cream-colored linen is the only touch of color in the room, a vibrant signal of the coming celebration. She moves back to the hearth. The applewood logs have turned to a landscape of glowing canyons and white-ash peaks. She adds a single, small branch of cedar to the coals. The cedar ignites instantly, a bright, crackling flare that releases a sharp, resinous perfume, the scent of the high mountains and the deep winter. She watches the flame until it dies back down into a steady, red pulse. The room is now perfectly prepared. The tools are away, the scraps are saved, The hearth is fed and the gift is ready. She climbs the ladder to the loft for the final night of the secret. As she lies beneath her own wool blankets, she listens to the house. The silence is different now. It is no longer a silence of waiting, but a silence of fulfillment. She thinks about the logistics of the morning. Thomas will return when the first light touches the peak of the great crag. He will be tired, his boots heavy with frozen snow, his breath a white plume in the sub-zero air. He will come to the hearth to warm his hands, and there, on the table, he will find the linen-wrapped bundle. The transition from night to dawn is a slow, achromatic crawl. The obsidian sky fades to a bruised purple, then to a cold, pearlescent gray. The frost on the window begins to glow with an internal light. Ilara wakes before the sun, her senses attuned to the distant sound of the world waking up. She hears it first as a rhythmic crunch, 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 the sound of heavy boots breaking through the frozen crust of the snow. It is a slow, steady pace, the pace of a man who has traveled through a storm and is finally nearing home. She descends the ladder and moves to the hearth. She does not light the lamp. The gray light of the dawn is enough. She stirs the coals and adds a handful of birch shavings, creating a small, welcoming flame. She then moves to the window and watches. Thomas emerges from the fog of the lower valley, a dark silhouette against the vast, white expanse. He carries his staff in one hand, his head bowed against the lingering chill. He moves with the weight of the winter on his shoulders. She hears the heavy iron latch of the door lift. Clack. The door creaks open on its leather hinges, and a rush of freezing air enters the room, a sharp, metallic reminder of the world beyond the walls. Thomas steps inside, bringing with him the scent of the frost and the vast, open sky. He stamps the snow from his boots, thump, thump, and leans his staff against the stone. He does not speak. The silence of the highlands is still upon him. He moves toward the hearth, his hands outstretched toward the small flame. His eyes fall upon the birch table. He sees the linen bundle, the crimson cord, and the silver light of the morning reflecting off the white fabric. He pauses, his hands still hovering over the fire. Ilara remains in the shadows of the weaving chamber, her breath slow and shallow. She watches as he moves toward the table, his movements hesitant and full of wonder. He reaches out and touches the crimson cord. His fingers, reddened by the cold, look dark against the linen. He unties the bow with a single, slow pull. The cord falls away, coiling on the table like a sleeping snake. He peels back the layers of lavender-scented linen, revealing the silver fox fur within. In the increasing light of the morning, the fur seems to ignite, the silver guard hairs shimmering with a brilliance that fills the room. He lifts the coat. The weight of it surprises him, his arms tensing as he takes the full measure of the silver and leather. He does not look for the seams. He does not see the 16 rabbit squares or the triple-layered linen core. He feels only the mass of it, the potential for warmth that it represents. He turns the coat around, seeing the high collar and the antler toggles. He runs his hand over the silver ruff, his fingers sinking into the softness. He slides his arms into the sleeves. SHH. The sound of the rabbit fur lining meeting his wool tunic is a soft, muffled rustle. He pulls the coat onto his shoulders, and the weight of it settles over him like a blessing. He reaches for the toggles, his fingers finding the smooth antler and the hard rawhide loops. Click, 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 Click. He secures the front, closing himself into the silver fortress. He stands there for a long time, his eyes closed. He can feel the immediate radiating heat of his own body being held against his skin by the dense fox fur. He can feel the softness of the rabbit lining against his neck and chin. He is no longer a man at the mercy of the winter. He is a man who carries his shelter with him. He looks toward Ilara in the shadows, a small, tired smile touching his face. No words are needed. The 10 days of silence, the thousands of stitches, and the secret hours of the night are all contained within the warmth he feels. The sun finally clears the peaks, a bright, golden spear of light that pierces the window and hits the silver fur of the coat. The room is transformed into a hall of light and warmth. The applewood fire crackles softly, the cedar scent lingers in the air, and the frost on the window begins to melt into 1,000 tiny, sparkling diamonds. The great coat has found its home. The winter will continue, the snow will fall, the winds will howl, and the frost will deepen. But inside the silver and the white, there is a peace that the cold cannot touch. Ilara moves to the hearth and begins to prepare the morning meal. The sound of the wooden spoon against the ceramic bowl, the sizzle of the fat in the pan, and the steady, rhythmic breathing of the man in the silver coat, all of it creates a new symphony of the domestic. The secret is over, and the winter has become a season of quiet, shared endurance. The world is white, the house is warm, and the work is, finally, complete. The end.